All right, let's dive right into this explainer and explore the fascinating, tragic, and honestly intensely complex downfall of Sir Thomas More. We're looking at a guy whose absolute conviction that no lay ruler held jurisdiction over the Church of Christ literally cost him his head. He flat out refused to bend down to a king, choosing instead to follow his religious beliefs as a true Christian. It's a massive story of faith, power, and treason that still resonates with us today.
But before we get into the crazy legal chess match that ended his life, we kind of have to ask ourselves, who was the real Thomas More? Was he this saintly martyr who bravely refused to bow down to a king to fulfill his duty as a true Christian? Or was he a ruthless fanatic who mercilessly burned his religious opponents? Well, as we'll see from the historical record, it paints a picture of a man who was basically both.
So, here's how we're going to unpack this whole web of Tudor politics. 1. The rise of a chancellor. 2. The war on heresy. 3. The point of no return. 4. The legal trap. And 5. The complex legacy. Let's just jump right in.
Okay, starting with Section 1, the rise of a chancellor.
Now, More's sheer brilliance definitely made him a favorite of King Henry VIII. But, pop culture totally misunderstands the guy. Hollywood loves to portray More, think of the movie A Man for All Seasons, as this lone champion of individual, private conscience taking on a corrupt state. But actually, the historical More believed that pushing your own private ideas against the collective community of Christian believers was a really dangerous sign of pride. To More, God spoke through the unified consensus of Christendom, not some isolated individual. So for him, it wasn't about what he believed privately, it was about what the church believed.
And you can see how his intellectual gifts, his sharp mind, and this unfailing moral integrity launched him on this insanely rapid career in public administration. I mean, he goes from Parliament to Speaker of the House of Commons, and then finally, in 1529, King Henry VIII appoints him Lord Chancellor. He was actually the very first layman to ever hold that massive position.
Which brings us to Section 2, the war on heresy.
To really get inside More's head, we've got to look at his most time-consuming job as Chancellor, which was defending the Catholic Church from the Protestant Reformation. Now, we celebrate his moral integrity, sure, but our sources show he waged an absolute, implacable war on heretics. Take John Tewkesbury, for example. He was a leather seller caught harboring translated New Testaments, and he was burned at the stake. And More's documented reaction? He literally stated that Tewkesbury burned because there was never a wretch better worthy of it. Richard Bayfield was caught distributing Bibles and was, quote, well and worthily burned. James Bainham was even arrested on More's own personal warrant. So yeah, this was a man entirely willing to use the ultimate power of the state to crush anything he saw as a threat to Christendom.
Moving to Section 3, the point of no return.
This exact same uncompromising nature meant More could literally never accept Henry VIII separating from the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn, mainly because it meant Henry declaring himself supreme head of the Church. The real turning point hits in February 1531. King Henry demands the English clergy acknowledge this new title. The clergy, completely terrified. Archbishop Warham finds this highly specific legal loophole, adding the phrase, as far as the law of Christ allows. When he presented this, the clergy were just shocked into silence, so Warham proclaimed the legal maxim, qui tacit consentur videtur, meaning silence gives consent. And More watched this whole maneuver happen with deep, deep alarm.
Completely unwilling to support the king's great matter or bow to a lay ruler's jurisdiction over the church, More did something drastic. He gave up his immense power. He resigned as Lord Chancellor in 1532 and withdrew into absolute poverty with his family. He basically hoped he could just step away from public life, keep his head down, and remain silent. But, as you might guess, silence in Tudor England was about to become incredibly dangerous.
And that leads right into Section 4, the legal trap.
You see, Henry VIII and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, they just couldn't let a guy with More's massive public influence quietly disappear. His silent disapproval was practically deafening. And this timeline shows how the legal squeeze rapidly escalated, closing the net around More step by step. First, they subdue the clergy. Then in April 1534, they passed the Act of Succession. More refused to swear the oath because it implicitly denied papal supremacy. And boom, he's thrown in the Tower of London. But here's the catch. Refusing the oath was only punishable by prison. So the Crown passes the Treason Act later that year, making it an actual death penalty offense to maliciously deny the king's new titles using words or writing.
Now keep in mind, More was a brilliant lawyer, probably the best in all of England. And he specifically remembered Archbishop Warham using that Latin maxim, qui tacit consentere videtur,
silence gives consent, to trap the clergy earlier, while More decided to flip the script and turn this legal principle right back against the king. He firmly believed that under the law he could not be convicted of treason as long as he didn't explicitly speak out against the king's supremacy.
His defense strategy was just a tactical courtroom masterpiece. He used his silence as an impenetrable shield against a law that specifically required explicit words to prove treason. He simply refused to answer any interrogations while locked up in the tower. I mean, think about it. How do you convict a man of a speech crime when he literally refuses to speak? It absolutely drove Thomas Cromwell and the King's Council mad.
So, because his silence couldn't be broken legally, his enemies had to cheat. They had to rely on this highly questionable testimony from Solicitor General Richard Rich to finally secure a fatal blow. Rich basically claimed that in a private conversation in the Tower, More explicitly denied that Parliament could make the king supreme head of the church. More vehemently denied this, pointing out Rich's well-known lack of honesty. And what's really wild is that two other men who were in the exact same room supposedly packing up More's books testify that they, conveniently, didn't hear the conversation at all. But the trap was sprung.
15. That is exactly how many minutes it took the jury to return a guilty verdict against him on July 1st, 1535. And after that verdict, knowing for a fact he was a dead man, More finally broke his silence. He openly declared that the act of supremacy was completely impious, an invasion of the rights of the church, and directly contrary to the Magna Carta. He refused to bend down to a king, proving his primary allegiance was always to his faith.
Which brings us to our final section, number 5, the complex legacy.
On July 6, 1535, More mounted a very shaky scaffold and was beheaded. But, as we know, his story certainly didn't end on that executioner's block. Despite his harsh, uncompromising actions against heretics, his ultimate defense of the Church's freedom from state interference actually led Pope John Paul II to declare him a patron saint for politicians in the year 2000. The Pope emphasized his service to justice over power and his absolute defense of the primacy of conscience, stating that More refused to compromise his moral values simply to please a ruler.
And these historically verified final words perfectly encapsulate the tragedy of a man who tried so desperately to follow the laws of his country, but just completely refused to bend his religious beliefs to a king. Just a quick side note to clarify here, Hollywood almost always misquotes this as, "but God's first." However, historical eyewitness accounts confirm he actually said, "and God's first." He loved his country, he served his king diligently, but he recognized a higher, spiritual authority that he simply would not betray.
So how does history ultimately judge a man whose absolute, uncompromising conviction made him both a merciless persecutor and a revered martyr? It leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to ponder about the true cost of unyielding belief in a rapidly changing world. Thomas More's conviction that no temporal ruler could govern the spiritual realm drove him to burn those who challenged his church, but it also drove him to lay his own head on the block rather than submit. So what do you think? Was he a true Christian hero of conscience? A victim of his own uncompromising ideology, or simply a man caught in the shifting tectonic plates of history? Thank you for exploring this explainer with me.